Thank you very much for joining us to talk about, as Helen said, one of my very favourite engineers, and probably the first one I really did any proper research into, Miss Jeanie Dicks, who electrified Winchester Cathedral. I first met Miss Jeanie Dicks a few years ago now in the pages of the Women's Engineering Journal, about 83 years after her 15 minutes of international fame. But to give a little bit of background context before I go into her actual story, I'm going to just talk a little bit about electricity, which is the whole basis of her amazing career. In the 1930s, which is when this story takes place, electricity was still really cutting edge technology. Very few people had grown up with it. A few houses had loads of electricity in it. Most places maybe had a light bulb or two. People were scared of electricity. It was marketed as the wizard in the wall, and not just for a short amount of time, but for a good percentage of the 1930s. And you can see from this cutting, it went into all different types of newspapers: the Times, the Daily Express, the Sun, Punch, and the Radio Times. So they used it for all different classes and educational backgrounds. But people were really quite scared of it. And until then, gas had been the prime way of lighting and heating to some extent, but also cooking, once people had moved away from coal fires. And the gas industry were not above a certain amount of dodgy advertising claiming electricity was really, really bad for you, and spreading all sorts of rumours. And one of the women in the Women's Engineering Society, she was the secretary of WES, was called Caroline Hazlitt. And Caroline Hazlitt was called the secretary. I think that's a title which kind of hides just how amazing she was. And there could be a whole, many talks, PhDs, research about Caroline Hazlitt. She's ultimately most well known perhaps for being the person responsible for us getting the 3-pin plug in this country. But she saw electricity as a way of women being set free from drudgery, so they could have time for themselves, to go and earn money, to go and just have a life. And a lot of her work was inspired by seeing how backbreaking her own mother had found domestic work, looking after a family of 3 children and her husband. So when you think about the size of some families, that was really quite small at the time. But Caroline Hazlitt was a networker par excellence. And would invite people to join WES and connect them up and introduce them to other people. And we think, although I have no definitive proof quite yet, that Jeanie Dicks was one of those people she met somewhere and got involved. So my first sighting of Miss Jeanie Dicks was in the pages of the Woman Engineer, which is the journal of the Women's Engineering Society, and which Caroline Hazlitt was the editor of for many years. And I just started doing some work for WES in preparation for their 1919 to 2019 centenary, and I was going through the Women Engineers journals, which are digitised and really worth a little wander down if you have some time to kill and get intrigued and start Googling people. I'm a historian, and I was surrounded by engineers, and this was new to me because I'd spent my entire career in the heritage sector, and people understanding when I got talking about history things, and said I'd start wittering about it to the engineers, and they'd look at me very politely, but what on earth is she on about? So when I was flicking through and I realised that this word flicked out to me, cathedral, because I'm a medievalist by original training, and I thought, oh, Winchester Cathedral, I've been there a few times, this is interesting. So a woman installed electricity. Oh, well, she must, in that case, be quite well known then. I'll give her a Google. I couldn't find much about her at all. So I had a bit more of a dig round in the rest of the Woman Engineer and found an entry from a few years previously. Miss Dicks of Winchester, who was a member of the Electrical Contractors Association. I thought that's very interesting. And clearly it's a family business, Messrs Dixon Limited. And I thought that's a nice dress. That's an interesting name of the woman who took the photograph. We'll come back to that later, because that was part of a later piece of the discovery. So I gave up on Google and then started looking at some historical sources online at first. And the British newspaper article came up trumps. 1934, the Dean and Chapter of Winchester Cathedral want to raise £1 sorry, £10,000 by the end of the summer to undertake the heating and lighting work, and that's about 1.92 million equivalent today. And this picture is of Winchester Cathedral with some of the first floodlighting ever to be put on it. And something that occurred to me somewhere in the middle of this research is that cathedrals have been around for several hundred years, but electricity had only been around for sort of, well, 40 years at most, and certainly not in any usable form when Miss Dicks was working. So again, who on earth actually electrified all the cathedrals and churches and everywhere else that had been built previously? And he sort of realised just what a sort of boom industry electrification was at the time. And more little snippets came up from the British Newspaper Archive. A woman's cathedral job. A woman is in charge of the job of installing electrical lights. Useful snippet at the bottom. Miss Dicks, on the death of her father, took up control of his business, secured the contract in competition with famous British and continental firms. And that just became even more intriguing because she's not running a small tin pot idea. She must have had a pretty big company to be able to find off all of those competitions, because these jobs were tendered out in a really professional manner. And to win that contract, you're going to have had to make a really good impression. And it's a bit like Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire. Jeanie would have had to kind of do the same stuff, but backwards and in high heels in terms of skills and impressing people. So how did that happen? One of the problems, of course, with searching names in the British Newspaper Archive is it pops up the odd red herring. In this case, a ballet girl named Jeanie Dicks, but back in 1909, who unfortunately got into terrible trouble for throwing vitriol in the face of a chauffeur. So I was quite glad to discover that our Jeanie was not done for any sort of criminal behaviour of any description, but that also she'd been covered in the international as well as the British papers. And the Sydney Mail in Australia, which I dug out of Trove, which is the online newspaper archive in Australia, which is the most amazing resource. And if you're researching British history, because it was all part of the Commonwealth, they often feature some quite interesting things, particularly on the women's pages. And I've tracked down quite a few British women engineers being showcased as a sort of, women breaking the glass ceiling and just doing interesting stuff. Clearly, the cartoonist had a certain viewpoint he wanted to express about a woman being in charge and the men at bay, whereas the International Women's News in February 1934 was considerably more respectful of her care. And it's quite interesting to note here, the essential modern development is in harmony with the ancient beauty it is to illuminate. And as I got to know Miss Dicks more, I did discover that she had a reputation for knowing what just looks right and putting a huge amount of effort into ensuring that did happen. And again, in 1935, Winifred Holtby, who actually died that year, she died very young, but she was quite an iconic feminist writer. And this book, Women in a Changing Civilization, was absolutely cutting edge. It's the equivalent of some of the stuff by Benjamin Greer in the 70s, Caroline Criado Perez these days. It really put women and feminism and successful women breaking, again, the glass ceilings, or in fact the line, into contrast. Without thinking too much about it, they have as successfully broken the line between women's interests and men's interests as the English woman electrical engineer, Miss Jeanie Dicks, who secured the contract for rewiring Winchester Cathedral. So in the mid-1930s, Miss Jeanie Dicks was kind of maybe even a household name. People go, oh yes, I read about her somewhere. So she then just sort of vanished. So this is putting her back into the scene a bit, which is something that makes me happy to get not forgotten women, but undiscovered women or rediscovered women back. So my decision, having done all this, I thought, I could write a blog or something. And then I tripped over the concept of being able to edit Wikipedia. Luckily, having gone to a conference organised by some historians who were connected to WES. And Miss Jeanie Dicks's Wikipedia page is the very first one I actually wrote. So it's not the best one. Now, I made quite a few rookie mistakes, but basically, if you don't have a Wikipedia page, you are Googled and then you're not notable. If it doesn't come up, people sort of dismiss, oh, you're not important then. So I thought it was really important to find enough information and really good citations that I could actually write her Wikipedia page. Now, that could have been the end of it, really. except I have a friend who actually works for the National Heritage Open Days office, and bless her, she had listened to me slowly reveal my fabulous findings about Miss Dicks, and made the connection with Winchester, where there's a large festival every year for Heritage Open Days, and she introduced me to the organisers, and they snapped up and said, oh, well, yes, it'd be lovely if you come and give us a talk about it. So I thought, great, fantastic. Up went the picture and the adverts, and that's kind of, I thought that would probably be it. You know, I'll talk to a captive audience of a few people who would have turned up on the night, and then, you know, everyone would have moved on a bit. But it turned out that a gentleman living in Winchester by the name of Andy Alexander had actually worked for the company that evolved out of Messrs Dicks Limited, and he'd recently retired and had rescued lots of interesting looking paperwork from the office as the company was starting to close down in 2018. And he emailed Winchester Heritage Office, and they passed it on to me and said, do you think you might be interested? And I thought, oh, I think I would be. And so we got in touch, and he said, well, I've deposited it at Hampshire Archives, which made History Geek me very, very happy, because it wasn't living in a damp shed somewhere. So I went down to Winchester, met Andy, had a great chat, and then went and spent 3 glorious days ferreting around in these couple of boxes he deposited at the archives. It hadn't even been catalogued yet. It had literally been there for a few weeks, and they let me go in and have a look. And I got probably slightly overexcited. I think the archivist thought I was really quite potty, really, because I kept squeaking when I discovered something new. And what I did discover was a sort of potted history of, or at least tantalising glimpses of, Jeanie Dicks' family, including, for the very first time, something from the woman herself, her own words, and this is her signature. And that was probably when I gave biggest squeak of all, when I actually found that. But to go back a little bit in history, this is her grandfather's shop. So her grandfather had moved down from Scotland and set up business in Winchester. And originally he'd been a gas fitter, and then sold gas and fancy goods to go with all the sort of domestic gas fittings. It's quite a high-end shop. And you can see this here. We're not completely sure, but we think this is Jeanie's grandfather and maybe her father or her uncle. And Philip is Jeanie's father. And you can see him here much later in life, standing up in the paler suit with a hat on the left there. And then Mrs. Frances Dicks, who is Jeanie's mother, is this lady here. And so these photos were in then, putting it all into context. And this looks like it's a works outing from some of the faces that I recognise from some other photographs. And then there were a couple of really long, those sort of school photos that were always get rolled up in a scroll, lurking in the background. And this was fascinating. And I sort of looked at it, and eventually realised someone had marked Miss Jeanie Dicks in the 3rd row, and there she is. And a little bit of digging made it clear that despite the fact there are lots of women, all of whom seem to be wearing a cloche hat, in this picture, Miss Dicks was the only one there in her own right. She wasn't the +1, she wasn't the wife, she wasn't the daughter, she wasn't the sort of person you'd taken with you. She was an electrical contractor herself, and she was there for that purpose. And you can just see slightly blurry close-up there of her with, you know, quite a determined looking face. And this is in 1928 at the Electrical Contractors Association conference in Cheltenham Spa. Now this takes us back to the original picture and the one we put on her Wikipedia page. And the photograph itself is a bit blurry, it's not fabulous, but oh, isn't it interesting? Because now we know it was actually taken at the Pittville Pump Rooms in Cheltenham Spa. And one of the people who was involved in Winchester Heritage Open Days Festival is an architectural historian who looked at it and thought about it and went, oh, I know where that was taken. So it's all tying things together. And the photograph, the name on the bottom of the person who took it was Mrs. LLB Atkinson. And so I went and had a little bit of a dig around about that. And it turns out she was Nellie Neescott, wife of leading electrical engineer Llewellyn Burchell Atkinson, president of the Institution of Electrical Engineers. And I include this partly because it's really interesting to see how women were getting involved in the whole conferences, but the fact that the couple named their first daughter Phyllis Electra, which I think is a wonderful way of completely owning what you do for a living. So we're starting to build a little bit of a picture about Jeanie's life here. Not that many details and still very, very little in her own words, but we're getting an idea of what she did before her moment in fame. And she's certainly holding her own, because again, it's a bit of a Where's Wally? This is 1931, the photograph of all the members. And again, she's the only woman at all in this photograph, without hat this time, but she's just there in the middle. And a close-up again, if it's much easier to see, there she is. And this photo was a photo montage that they'd sort of put all the background, all the people against one background. And again, it's quite interesting to see that she is sort of front and center and they're not stick her in a corner. She's clearly holding her own there, which when you read some of her correspondence, you realize that, yeah, she was not going to be a shrinking violet in any company. But this is a bit of a swap now to some different people. This is the wedding photograph of E. Gordon Selwyn and Phyllis Eleanor Hoskins, who married in 1910. But in 1931, the year that the second photograph was taken, it's kind of the year that Jeanie's career was made, and she became, these are the roots of where she became a really, really successful businesswoman and electrical contractor. So in 1931, a much older couple, the Selwyns, and their 4 children moved to the deanery in Winchester, and this photo's from a bit earlier. Now, Winchester's quite known for having a certain sogginess about it. The cathedral was stuck back together by the Victorian chap in a bell diving suit. Call it a cathedral with a soggy bottom, if you like. And all the buildings nearby suffered equally from damp. And when you're a dean in the Church of England, your wife is sort of, if you like, a corporate wife. She needs to entertain, you host people all the time. It's all about the politics and the making things. And Dean Selwyn was a man with things to prove, deeply ambitious churchman. He'd made dean quite young, and he was really going to make Winchester his own. And whilst he wasn't completely in charge, because the dean's not quite at the top of the tree, certainly for his career there, he seems to have been the leading light, if you like, in putting Winchester back on the map. And so they hired a local company to come and sort the building out. It hadn't been lived in for a while. It needed electricity. It really wasn't plumbed in at all. And Mrs. Selwyn was a key person in the relationship. She needed her house laid out that way that you would need it for running, you know, big hostess parties, having overnight guests, and everything needed to work. And Jeanie seems to have been a marvellous project manager. She fixed issues. She never criticised the client. The letters to the suppliers, very tough but fair. But if someone has not delivered, oof, she's not happy about it. And she was very, very good at using the dean's title as a sort of a pointy stick as well. But she seems to have really impressed the couple and developed a really good working relationship with them, which clearly stood her in good stead when the dean started looking for people to work on basically modernising and improving and restoring Winchester Cathedral. And this is him a little bit later on in life. And this is a very scrappy bit of paper, but it's a fabulous bit of paper from my perspective. So in September 1933, the consultant engineers for Winchester Cathedral, who were Mrs. Wingfield Bowles of London, you can just about make out the name in the corner there, issued a call for tenders for the electric lights and accessory work for the cathedral in Winchester. And Miss Dicks sprang at the chance of getting such an interesting, meaty contract. And she was successful, partly because the dean knew the quality of her work. And ultimately, the Dicks company takes on heating, boilers, sound systems, and it goes on from the early 30s into the late 1940s. And it probably goes beyond, but I can't prove that yet because the paperwork I was actually playing with runs out in the early 1950s, but there are probably records in the cathedral if we want to go and dig further into it. But sadly, COVID got in the way of all the research, and it's had a bit of a back seat now. But the Dean was very good at selling things, raising money, and doing, I suppose, what we call these days media spin. So the fact he'd appointed a woman meant he was also going to promote the fact he'd appointed a woman, because it was incredibly newsworthy. And sometimes she's called a woman, and sometimes she's called a girl. And bearing in mind she's pushing 40 at this point, I mean, you know, there's flattery, and then there's just being a little bit sexist, really, isn't there? But in the British Newspaper Archive, Miss Dicks keeps getting mentioned different places, and you can see this one's from the West Sussex Gazette. There was an early one from Lancaster, as you can see. They also, from the cartoons, international market as well. And so it was all part of the fundraising scheme and the promotion of things. And it's gone up now, the Dean's heating and lighting scheme, from £10,000 to £20,000, and they want to reconstruct the organ. So the ambition is growing and growing. And Miss Dicks and her staff's skills and ambitions and ability to deliver are doing the same thing. So we mentioned that the cathedral's a bit soggy, and obviously electricity and water are not knowing for being the best of bedfellows. So 5 miles of specially made wire were made to cope with the damp in the cathedral. You can just see a very, very poor photograph here with Miss Dicks supervising in the background as 2 of the men are doing something with the cabling. And when it was under the floor, because a lot of the wiring had to go underneath the floor, it was surrounded by a type of tarmac. And when it was above the floor, again, it was covered in far more padding material than wiring from the 1930s. And if you think back to old wiring, you might have seen with sort of brown thread around it. I remember my grandfather had a lot of that in his house, and we were always told never to go anywhere near it with water as children, because he still had the paranoia about 1930s electricity, which I think a lot of other people were working with as well. So Miss Dicks was basically working on the permanent lighting, but also when George V's Silver Jubilee came around in 1935, they bid for the flood lighting for the exterior contract as well. And again in the 1930s, external flood lighting, seriously complicated and at the mercy of the weather as well. And then in 1937, still working, and this is the attention to detail, a wonderful example in this letter of the shape of the shade you wish to try at the cathedral in the choir stalls. And she had a whole range of different things made for experimenting with, and she was known for spending quite a lot of time in the cathedral in the evenings trying to get the light right. And she'd have 2 members of staff up in the gods putting bits of glass and different shades of glass in different places in front of the shade, so she could analyze whether it was giving off the right sort of light. And this would go on for weeks at a time sometimes until they got it quite right. And in the middle of all of this, in 1937, we're not quite sure when they met, Miss Dicks married Ian McVean, a traveller for Beeston Boiler Company, and was not a member of the cathedral's usual congregation. Dean Selwyn married the couple in the cathedral, which again was a sign of considerable respect, and gave the couple a white vellum covered copy of the book he'd written on the history of Winchester Cathedral. I have yet to work out where that book might actually be, but I do love her wedding dress, I have to say. So she was stylish and a businesswoman. And her signature changes to J. McVean instead. And it's mildly annoying that her husband's name is Ian, because actually I and J are a little bit confusing. So after that, you have to check which one of them is signing the paperwork in the company very carefully, because he joined it and ultimately started running it more and more towards the end of her career. And again, another letter I want to share here that I just adore, because it's really, really double checking about the quality of that wiring we talked about earlier. And the fact that the crypt is very damp indeed. And in fact, the floor is sometimes covered with water. We want a definite assurance that under these circumstances, the cable is still, in your opinion, quite suitable. And And I'm going to have to start writing letters like this in work. I probably get told off for getting a bit stroppy these days, but it's a good business letter. And there are quite a few letters back from the Dean himself, bit more soft in many ways, and very charming. And I love the fact that in his letters he uses the church times phones of Michaelmas rather than months of the year. Certain details to be discussed with regard to other parts of the cathedral, about which I hope I may see you at an early date. And they're just wonderfully gentlemanly letters. And there's loads of these in these boxes in the archives. And it just shows an interesting experience that and relationship that had been developed, working between the two. And again, this is another double quality checking letter from Miss Dicks, who's basically, I need to really check that things are working properly. And then a response from the Dean saying, I'm sure it's absolutely fine, although, you carry on if you want to do a bit more. So it's clearly pretty happy clients there, really, I would say, which is wonderful. And this takes us to September 1939, with the outbreak of the Second World War and the register, which was taken in 1939. The 1931 census sadly got destroyed in fire in the Second World War, and they didn't take one in 1941. So this is really the only snapshot we get of things for that 20 years. And you can see here we've got Ian McVeigh, who was a managing director and heating engineer, and Maud Jeanie McVeigh, who interestingly at this point seems to have shaved a few years off her birthday, because I think she was a bit older than this. A managing director, electrical engineer, and interestingly trained to be an ARP ambulance driver. So that implies she probably had driven her own car quite a bit, which is something else would be kind of interesting as another research rabbit hole to go down one day. And again, in 1939, it turns out that Miss I. McVeigh has been elected president of the Winchester Chamber of Commerce. And so she's clearly flexing her muscles in the business worlds as well as the church and electrical worlds. And in 1939, more work comes, cathedral, new work. Despite the war, they're still kind of having to fix things and make things work, and churches are quite important. But sadly, and you see at the bottom, and the bid, unfortunately, the man who did this work is now in the army. Otherwise, he would no doubt have brought this to the notice of the foreman who has been in charge of the whole cathedral work. And it's becoming an increasing challenge to get people who are fully qualified, because presumably the army is grabbing anyone with a useful skill like being an electrician. But through the 1940s, and you see these letters reflecting issues about running a business and trying to do things in the Second World War. And I love the fact that, realizing the difficulty of traveling nowadays, the Dean has agreed to make this time elastic. I just love the idea of that. Then it moves on to looking at other works that they start doing at this time as well. And they've got a contract for the Ministry of Works, which is really, really good, because that's got their foot in the door for all sorts of things post-war as well, which really put the company on a bigger and bigger footing. They start working for all the local authorities, what becomes the NHS, and ultimately the company becomes, under people who inherit it after Jeanie, a massive engineering company, real specialists who worked on most of the cinemas in Leicester Square, doing the electrifications there. And some of the staff even went out to work on aircraft hangars for Colonel Gaddafi, although they were a bit cagey about quite what they were doing when I chatted to a couple of them in the pub a little while back. You also see things in the Second World War about when things have got bombed, they're getting much politer responses from Miss Dicks when they say, so sorry, we couldn't quite get the samples to you. We got burnt out last night. And her letters change in tone to be more supportive about things like that. All sorts of interesting things. The organ needs sorting out. And again, trying to find bits of stuff in the Second World War. How important is an organ in the greater scheme of things when everything else is under some form of rationing, particularly metal and anything that can be used for armaments? But the Second World War moves on, and this is a photograph of Jeanie McVean in 1950. And it's about this time that Jeanie starts taking more of a back seat in the company. There's a couple of very slight mentions of her health not being quite what it should be in letters that Ian McVean sends. And I don't know much more about that, but at the staff party that this is celebrating for the anniversary, the jubilee of 3 of the staff, and it's the staff who have really supported Jeanie for many, many years in this company, and been loyal companions, but she's not the one doing the speaking anymore. Particularly, it's Mr. McVean instead, and this is the menu from the Cardena Cafe where they had the party. And I must admit, I'm quite liking the look of meringue glacé chantilly, to be honest, of that, if nothing else. And they still had quite a lot of staff, about 75 staff still at this point, and they had 2 shops by the 1950s, one in Winchester and one in Andover. And business seemed to be doing quite well because there were 1 or 2 budget sheets included in these papers. And not that I know much about running an electrical place, but the colour red didn't seem to appear in the wrong places. And this is a gathering of the staff at this party. You can see lots of people involved. Now, I've yet to discover any women employed in the company, unless they were in the secretarial format, apart from Miss Dicks herself. But I am hoping one day to discover a little bit more about it. But the men who worked for her, including these chaps who are being celebrated here, describe her as firm but fair. Oh, she's a woman, but actually, you know, we're quite proud of our Miss Dicks, really. And that's what she was always called, even when she became Mrs. McVean. The staff always called her Miss Dicks. And one of the other wonderful little nuggets that I discovered whilst researching this is that when they were putting the underfloor heating in the pipes, they had to take out a lot of coffins, and they buried most of them very carefully in holy ground outside the cathedral. But Jane Austen is buried in Winchester Cathedral, and so instead of putting her outside, they moved her coffin gently to one side and laid the pipes instead. I must admit, when I was in the cathedral, her grave is to the left of this picture, as you can see with a little arrow there. And there was me busy taking photographs of the radiators, whilst there was a whole load of people gathered round the grave of Jane Austen. And there was me getting overexcited about these radiators. But these radiators were the subject of a lovely note that the Dean of Winchester Cathedral, Dean Selwyn, wrote her in the late 1950s when he was clearly getting very tired now. He was an old man and wanted to retire. He'd lost his first wife and a son in the Second World War, and, you know, he just wanted to let go. But he wrote her a lovely, lovely note just saying how glad he was that they had won their battle to get radiators put into Winchester Cathedral. I had to explain that story to the gentleman in the cassock, who was giving me a very funny look when I was trying to get a good shot of the radiators. And in 1960, Jeanie Dicks decided it was time to retire. So she sold her company for this whole grand sum of £1 to 4 of her loyal staff, some of whom had worked with her for years and years. And it became Dicks Electrical Installations Limited, which kept going, as I said, and doing some really big electrical contracting work up until 2018, when sadly it got acid raided and ultimately shut down. Her husband died in the early 70s. She lived for the last few years in a nursing home in Winchester, and people had sort of forgotten about the role she played. And when she died, there was something in the Hampshire Chronicle of one of the city's leading businesswomen for over 40 years. She had been in declining health for some time. But that was the last mention she got in the press for a very, very long time, sadly. But nevertheless, we have now rediscovered her. She's been rediscovered in Winchester. Her name is being included in Great Women of Hampshire. She has a Wikipedia page. People are reading it on a daily basis. So at this point, I'm going to draw to a close with a lovely note that was in the archives. Leave it, Ms. Dicks.
Thank you very much, Carol. That was lovely. That was really, really interesting. Obviously, I've been working with you for a while and in the past few years, and although you've always mentioned Jeanie, I've never actually heard you speak about her, and that's been really, really interesting. Julie, I don't know whether you want to ask any questions. I've got one question for you, Ceryl, and that is with regards to the name Wingfield. The partners Wingfield Bowles. I'm just wondering whether that's any connection to Molly Wingfield, who was friends with Verena Holmes. And Verena and Molly's brother made that piece of equipment for the tuberculosis, the neurothoracic equipment. So that's, I can't remember what his first name was, but I'm just wondering whether there's a route there.
So it's Mrs. Wingfield Bowles, who were consulting engineers of 28 Victoria Street, SW1. And there are some more things in the archives signed by particular people from that company. So maybe there is yet another connection.
There might be a connection there.
Definitely worth a look.
Okay. Julie, have you got anything you'd like to? Are you still there, Julie? Can't think of any questions right now.
Yeah, I'm still here. Yeah, I can't think of anything, to be honest. It's so much wonderful information to just take in. But I love that she stayed in Winchester most of her life.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, there's records of them going on holidays occasionally in the 50s and 60s, but they go to somewhere like Devon and things like that, rather than any, you know, spreading any further. But she's, I think you could almost the word they use for sheep in the nicest possible way, it's hefted, that you were, you know, you're in your territory. She was a big fish in a small pond, but she had a sort of a base, but they reached out. One simple thing I didn't include really is this: where do you stop sometimes? But almost all the country houses within that area of Hampshire, they probably had the Dicks company doing some sort of electrical or boiler heating or something for them. Any of the big buildings in Winchester, according to the chaps who worked for the company, and one or two of them were very, very young apprentices when she retired, and they sort of vaguely remember a slightly formidable lady, but they picked up the stories. And it was that basically, if you wanted electrical stuff done in Hampshire from the sort of 30s to the 60s, you went to Mrs. Dicks Limited, which is kind of, I love the fact that, you know, it's run by a woman, but nevertheless, and that, you know, you should get the usual stories of someone ringing up and wanting to talk to a man, and they say, well, I get the boss, and then it's her, and they go, no, I want the boss, and she says, yes, I am the boss. You know, the stories that, well, we still get to some extent today, and the fact that the lads just, you know, quite not defensive, but very sort of, yeah, she's our Miss Dicks, you know, don't you have a go at her, she's the gaffer, which you know, they wouldn't have put up with it, I suspect, had she not had a really decent control of things.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to stop recording now, but I do want Julie to stay with us for a second.